The desert stretched endlessly before them, a merciless expanse of red dust and broken dreams that shimmered under the brutal Arizona sun of 1882. It was a land that chewed up the weak and spat out their bones, where only the hardest souls could scratch out a living from the unforgiving earth. The heat rose in waves from the cracked ground, distorting the horizon until it seemed to dance like a fever dream. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the sky, their flesh storing precious water that might as well have been gold for all the good it did, the three women huddled in their meager shade. They said it wasn't fit for decent folk, especially not women traveling alone. The frontier was a man's world, built on violence and conquest, where strength was the only currency that mattered, and weakness was a luxury that could get you killed. But that's exactly where Clara, Beth, and Molly found themselves, standing on the knife's edge between life and death, with nothing but each other to keep them breathing. Clara crouched beside the last dregs of their water, the liquid barely covering the bottom of the cracked canteen. The metal was hot enough to burn skin, radiating heat like a miniature sun, but she pressed it against her chapped lips anyway, letting a single precious drop fall onto her tongue. It tasted of rust and desperation, of the long journey that had brought them to this God-forsaken place. The sun hung like a malevolent eye in the cloudless sky, baking the earth until it cracked like a broken promise. Every breath felt like swallowing fire, the dry air scorching her throat and lungs. She pulled her torn bonnet lower over her face, the fabric providing scant protection from the relentless glare. The shade was a luxury they couldn't afford out here, miles from anything resembling civilization. Her dress, once blue as a summer sky back in Kansas, was now the color of dried blood and dust. The fabric clung to her skin, heavy with sweat and the weight of her circumstances, torn in a dozen places by thorns and rough travel. Behind her, Beth stirred restlessly in what little shelter they'd found beneath a cluster of thorny mesquite, their twisted branches offering precious little relief from the sun's assault. Her face was drawn tight with pain, her left arm cradled against her chest where Jake, her husband, had twisted it near to breaking the night before they'd been abandoned. The bruises on her throat were dark purple against her pale skin, finger-shaped marks that told the story of his rage as clearly as words written in ink. She'd tried to hide them, wrapping her torn shawl around her neck despite the oppressive heat, but the desert sun revealed everything, stripping away pretense as surely as it stripped moisture from their bodies. The memory was fresh as an open wound, sharp and jagged in her mind. Jake's hands around her throat, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her face as he'd hissed about her being worthless, about how she couldn't even give him a son worth having, how she was nothing but dead weight slowing them down. She'd clawed at his fingers, her vision going black at the edges, gasping for air that wouldn't come, until Clara had cracked a bottle over his skull. Even then, he'd only laughed, wiping blood from his scalp like it was nothing more than rainwater, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction that made her stomach turn. The other men had watched with the detached interest of spectators at a cockfight, making no move to intervene. Molly lay curled in the meager shade, her young face peaceful in sleep despite everything that had happened. At 19, she was the baby of the three, still clinging to fragments of hope that the others had long since abandoned. Her light brown hair had escaped its pins, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her dress was torn at the hem where she'd caught it on a cactus spine during their desperate flight from the wagon train. Her husband, Pete, had been the gentlest of the lot, or so they'd all thought. He'd courted her with wildflowers picked from roadside ditches and soft words whispered under starlit skies, but gentleness was a luxury the desert didn't permit, and Pete had learned to use his fists like the rest of them when the going got tough. The bruise across her cheek was yellowing now, a sickly reminder of his parting gift before they'd left her here to die alongside her sisters. Clara had seen it coming for weeks, had felt it in her bones like an old injury predicting rain. The way the men had grown quieter over the past month, their eyes sliding away when she looked at them directly. The hushed conversations that died abruptly when she approached their campfire. The way they'd started rationing the women's food while helping themselves to full portions, claiming the hard work of driving the wagon and tending the animals required more sustenance. She'd tried to warn her sisters, but they dismissed her concerns as paranoia born of her natural distrust of men in general, and their husbands in particular. Even now, part of her couldn't believe it had come to this, that 3 men who'd sworn before God and witnesses to love and protect them had instead chosen to leave them for dead in the middle of nowhere, taking everything of value and abandoning them to the merciless desert. The men had struck camp before dawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of thieves in the night. They'd taken everything worth taking: the horses, the wagon, all the supplies, even the women's few personal possessions. All that remained was what they wore on their backs, a half-empty canteen and a handful of hardtack that wouldn't last the day. No weapons to hunt with or defend themselves, no tools to dig for water or build shelter, just the vast emptiness of the Arizona territory and the slim hope that death would come quickly when their water ran out. But Clara had no intention of dying. Not here, not like this, not for the convenience of 3 worthless men who'd proven themselves cowards when it mattered most. She'd survived worse than this growing up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, had clawed her way out of deeper holes than a loveless marriage and an unforgiving desert. If this wasteland wanted her bones, it would have to fight for them. She'd been born Clara May Henderson on a patch of rocky ground that barely qualified as a farm, the eldest of 5 children in a family where love was as scarce as rain in August. Her father had been a hard man made harder by repeated crop failures and the bottle that had become his closest companion. Her mother had died birthing the youngest, worn out by endless pregnancies and the grinding poverty that defined their existence. At 16, Clara had married Tom Brennan, not out of love, but out of desperation, seeing marriage as the only escape from a house where her father's fists fell as regularly as the seasons. Tom had seemed different at first, gentler, more civilized than the rough men she'd grown up around. But the frontier had a way of stripping the veneer of civilization from even the most promising men, revealing the animal beneath. Tom had changed during their journey west, becoming more brutal with each passing mile. The dreams of a new life in California had soured into something ugly and mean, and Clara had borne the brunt of his disappointment. She'd learned to read the signs of his moods, to make herself small and quiet when the storm clouds gathered in his eyes. But sometimes her natural defiance would surface, and then there would be consequences. A sound drifted across the wasteland, faint but unmistakable to ears tuned by desperation to catch any sign of hope or danger. Hoofbeats, steady and rhythmic, growing louder with each passing second. Clara's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she squinted into the heat haze that danced above the desert floor. Could it be their husbands, returning with some twisted change of heart? The thought made her stomach clench with equal parts hope and dread. Hope because it might mean salvation from the slow death that awaited them. Dread because she knew what kind of reckoning would await them if Tom and the others had decided to return. They would pay dearly for the inconvenience their abandonment had caused. The riders appeared like mirages at first, wavering shapes that might have been tricks of the light playing across the superheated air. But as they drew closer, Clara could make out their forms more clearly. 3 men on horseback, but not the ones who'd abandoned them. These riders sat differently in their saddles, moved with a fluid grace that spoke of lives spent in harmony with the harsh landscape, rather than in constant battle against it. Apache. The word sent a chill down her spine despite the oppressive heat that pressed down on them like a physical weight. She'd heard the stories, whispered around campfires and in the back rooms of saloons from Kansas to California. Tales of raids and warfare, of settlers scalped and burned, of women carried off to fates worse than death. The newspapers back east were full of lurid accounts of Apache savagery, of Geronimo's warriors sweeping down from their mountain strongholds to strike terror into the hearts of peaceful settlers. But she'd also heard other stories, quieter ones told by traders and scouts who'd had actual dealings with the Apache people. Tales of honor and dignity, of a people fighting to protect what was theirs against an endless tide of invaders who brought disease and death in their wake. Stories of Apache women who were as fierce as their men, of children raised to be one with the desert that white men saw only as an obstacle to be conquered. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop perhaps 20 yards away, close enough that Clara could see the weathered lines of his face, the intelligence in his dark eyes as they took in the scene before him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with long black hair bound back with a strip of rawhide and skin bronzed dark by years under the desert sun. His face was angular and strong, marked by the kind of quiet confidence that came from a man comfortable with his place in the world. His clothes were practical rather than ornamental, buckskin leggings that had seen hard use, a cotton shirt open at the throat to catch what little breeze the desert offered, and a red bandana tied around his neck. A rifle rested across his thighs, the wood worn smooth by countless hands, but his posture was relaxed, his hands easy on the reins. He carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. Behind him rode two others, both studying the women with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. One was older, perhaps 50, his hair streaked with silver that caught the harsh desert light. His face bore the deep lines of someone who'd seen more than his share of hardship, but there was wisdom in his eyes, the kind that came from surviving in a world that offered few second chances. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. If this wasteland wanted her bones, it would have to fight for them. She'd been born Clara May Henderson on a patch of rocky ground that barely qualified as a farm, the eldest of 5 children in a family where love was as scarce as rain in August. Her father had been a hard man made harder by repeated crop failures and the bottle that had become his closest companion. Her mother had died birthing the youngest, worn out by endless pregnancies and the grinding poverty that defined their existence. At 16, Clara had married Tom Brennan, not out of love, but out of desperation, seeing marriage as the only escape from a house where her father's fists fell as regularly as the seasons. Tom had seemed different at first, gentler, more civilized than the rough men she'd grown up around. But the frontier had a way of stripping the veneer of civilization from even the most promising men, revealing the animal beneath. Tom had changed during their journey west, becoming more brutal with each passing mile. The dreams of a new life in California had soured into something ugly and mean, and Clara had borne the brunt of his disappointment. She'd learned to read the signs of his moods, to make herself small and quiet when the storm clouds gathered in his eyes. But sometimes her natural defiance would surface, and then there would be consequences. A sound drifted across the wasteland, faint but unmistakable to ears tuned by desperation to catch any sign of hope or danger. Hoofbeats, steady and rhythmic, growing louder with each passing second. Clara's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she squinted into the heat haze that danced above the desert floor. Could it be their husbands, returning with some twisted change of heart? The thought made her stomach clench with equal parts hope and dread. Hope because it might mean salvation from the slow death that awaited them. Dread because she knew what kind of reckoning would await them if Tom and the others had decided to return. They would pay dearly for the inconvenience their abandonment had caused. The riders appeared like mirages at first, wavering shapes that might have been tricks of the light playing across the superheated air. But as they drew closer, Clara could make out their forms more clearly. 3 men on horseback, but not the ones who'd abandoned them. These riders sat differently in their saddles, moved with a fluid grace that spoke of lives spent in harmony with the harsh landscape, rather than in constant battle against it. Apache. The word sent a chill down her spine despite the oppressive heat that pressed down on them like a physical weight. She'd heard the stories, whispered around campfires and in the back rooms of saloons from Kansas to California. Tales of raids and warfare, of settlers scalped and burned, of women carried off to fates worse than death. The newspapers back east were full of lurid accounts of Apache savagery, of Geronimo's warriors sweeping down from their mountain strongholds to strike terror into the hearts of peaceful settlers. But she'd also heard other stories, quieter ones told by traders and scouts who'd had actual dealings with the Apache people. Tales of honor and dignity, of a people fighting to protect what was theirs against an endless tide of invaders who brought disease and death in their wake. Stories of Apache women who were as fierce as their men, of children raised to be one with the desert that white men saw only as an obstacle to be conquered. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop perhaps 20 yards away, close enough that Clara could see the weathered lines of his face, the intelligence in his dark eyes as they took in the scene before him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with long black hair bound back with a strip of rawhide and skin bronzed dark by years under the desert sun. His face was angular and strong, marked by the kind of quiet confidence that came from a man comfortable with his place in the world. His clothes were practical rather than ornamental, buckskin leggings that had seen hard use, a cotton shirt open at the throat to catch what little breeze the desert offered, and a red bandana tied around his neck. A rifle rested across his thighs, the wood worn smooth by countless hands, but his posture was relaxed, his hands easy on the reins. He carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. Behind him rode two others, both studying the women with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. One was older, perhaps 50, his hair streaked with silver that caught the harsh desert light. His face bore the deep lines of someone who'd seen more than his share of hardship. But there was wisdom in his eyes, the kind that came from surviving in a world that offered few second chances. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. She forced herself to stop after a few swallows, her body crying out for more, but her mind insisting on rationing this precious gift. She turned to wake Beth and Molly, shaking them gently but urgently. Beth came awake with a start, her eyes wide with fear until she saw Clara's face. Molly stirred more slowly, emerging from the deep sleep of complete exhaustion, like a swimmer surfacing from great depths. They drank greedily when Clara offered them the water skin, liquid running down their chins as they tried to make up for days of deprivation. The Apache leader watched them with patient eyes, showing no impatience at their desperate thirst, no sign that he begrudged them even a single drop of the precious fluid. When they'd had their fill, he took back the water skin and corked it carefully, his movements economical and practiced. Water was life in the desert, and every drop was treated with the respect it deserved. "Your men?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. There was a hardness in his voice when he spoke the word men, a contempt that needed no translation. "Gone," Clara managed to croak, her voice still rough despite the water. "Left us." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, carrying all the shame and rage she felt at their abandonment. The man's expression darkened, a shadow of disgust crossing his features like a cloud passing over the sun. He said something to his companions that sounded like a curse, the harsh consonants crackling with anger. Then he looked back at the women with something that might have been pity, but which carried more weight than simple sympathy. "I am Nietzsche," he said, placing a hand on his chest in a gesture that seemed both formal and personal. The name meant something in his language, she could tell from the way he spoke it, but its meaning was lost on her. He gestured to the older man, whose weathered face remained impassive. "This is my uncle Chato." The name was spoken with deep respect, indicating that family relationships carried significant weight in Apache culture. The younger man received no introduction, but his hostile stare spoke volumes about his feelings toward their unexpected encounter. His dark eyes burned with resentment and suspicion, and Clara could see him fighting the urge to speak his mind. "I'm Clara," she replied, then indicated her sisters with a gesture that encompassed their battered condition. Beth and Molly. The names sounded strange, spoken aloud in this context, remnants of a world that seemed increasingly distant with each passing hour. Nietzsche nodded gravely, as if filing away the information for future use. He looked out at the empty landscape, his gaze sweeping the horizon with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading the desert's moods. Then he looked back at the women, his expression serious. "You cannot stay here," he said matter-of-factly, his English careful but clear. "The desert will kill you before the sun sets twice." There was no malice in the statement, just the practical assessment of someone who understood the harsh realities of survival in this unforgiving land. Clara felt a spark of hope flutter to life in her chest, quickly dampened by the suspicion that had become her constant companion. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the desperate hope that threatened to crack through her carefully maintained composure. "You come with us," Nietzsche said, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "Our village has food, water, shelter." He paused, studying her face as if reading her thoughts. "You will work for your keep, but you will live." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Clara was only beginning to understand. It meant survival, but at what cost? What kind of work would be expected of them? What would their status be in an Apache village? The questions multiplied in her mind faster than she could consider them. The younger Apache spoke up then, his English broken but passionate, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and frustration. "No! White eyes bring nothing but trouble. They lie, they steal, they kill our people. First they take our land, then they want our help when their own kind abandon them. Why should we help those who would see us all dead?" His words stung with their accuracy. Clara knew enough history to understand the source of his anger. The Apache had been fighting a losing war against American expansion for decades, watching their traditional lands carved up and distributed to settlers who saw the desert as nothing more than empty space to be claimed and conquered. Nietzsche turned to face him, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Because they are women without protection, Cochise. Because they have been wronged by their own kind, just as we have been wronged."
Because it is the right thing to do. His words carried the weight of deeply held conviction, the kind of moral certainty that could not be shaken by practical considerations. The younger man, Cochise, spat into the dust, his face twisted with disgust, but he didn't argue further. Clara could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression, the conflict between his personal hatred for whites and his respect for his leader's judgment. The older man, Chato, remained silent throughout the exchange, but Clara caught him nodding almost imperceptibly at Nietzsche's words. "What's the alternative?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still cradling her injured arm against her chest, her face pale with pain and exhaustion that even the life-giving water couldn't completely cure. "We can't make it on our own out here. We don't know the land, don't have supplies or weapons or any way to protect ourselves." Clara looked around at the empty wasteland that stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional cactus or scrub brush that somehow managed to survive in this hostile environment. The vultures she'd noticed earlier were circling closer now, their patience wearing thin as they waited for the inevitable feast. Even if rescue came eventually, they'd be long dead by then, just another collection of bones bleaching in the desert sun. The choice was simple when stripped of all pretense. Trust these strangers who had shown them more kindness in 10 minutes than their own husbands had managed in years of marriage, or die slowly under the merciless sun. When put in those terms, there was really no choice at all. "We'll come," she said, meeting Nietzsche's gaze squarely. "And we'll earn our keep, whatever that means." Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He turned and whistled sharply, a sound that cut through the desert air like a blade. His horse trotted over obediently, well-trained and responsive to its master's commands. "You ride with me," he told Clara, then gestured to the others. "My uncle will take the injured one. Cochise will take the young one." The arrangements were made with practical efficiency, taking into account Beth's injuries and the need to distribute weight evenly among the horses. Cochise muttered something under his breath that didn't sound complimentary, but he moved his horse closer to where Molly stood swaying on her feet. The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, taking in his hostile expression and the weapons he carried with obvious trepidation. But she allowed him to help her onto the horse's back, her movements clumsy with fatigue and inexperience. She'd never been much of a rider, had always preferred to walk rather than deal with the unpredictable nature of horses. Now she clung to the animal's mane with white knuckles, trying to find her balance as Cochise settled behind her. Beth required more assistance, her injuries making it difficult to mount behind Chateau. The older man was gentle with her, his weathered hands steady and patient as he helped her settle behind him. She gasped with pain as her injured arm jostled against his back, but she didn't complain. She'd learned long ago that complaint only made things worse. Clara found herself behind Nietzsche, her arms wrapped around his lean waist as they prepared to ride away from their makeshift shelter. She could feel the solid warmth of his body through his cotton shirt, could smell the sage and leather scent that clung to him like a second skin. The horse was strong beneath them, its muscles rippling with restrained power, its gait smooth and ground covering. As they rode away from the place where she'd been prepared to die, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. She'd learned to be suspicious of that particular emotion. But it was something close. A sense that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story after all. "Why are you helping us?" she asked as they rode, her voice barely audible over the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the sparse desert vegetation. Nietzsche was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sounds of their passage across the ancient landscape. Finally, he spoke without turning around, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of their movement. "I had a sister once," he said, the words weighted with old pain that time had not diminished. "She was taken by white soldiers when she was 14. They said she was being relocated for her own protection, but we knew better. She was sold to a brothel in Tucson, used by men who saw her as nothing more than a convenience to be purchased and discarded." Clara felt her stomach clench at the casual brutality of the statement, at the matter-of-fact way he described horrors that no child should have to endure. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort or express outrage, but the words stuck in her throat. "When I found her 2 years later," he trailed off, his shoulders tensing with the memory. "She was no longer the laughing girl who used to braid flowers in her hair and race the wind across the desert. The light had gone out of her eyes, replaced by something dark and broken that no amount of love could fix." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief, with rage that had been banked but never truly extinguished. Clara could feel the tension in his body, the careful control he maintained over emotions that ran deeper than the desert itself. "She took her own life 3 days after I brought her home," he continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his words. "Said she couldn't live with what they'd made her become. Said the desert would heal her spirit in ways that the world of men never could." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since the abandonment. Not tears of self-pity, but of something deeper, a recognition of shared pain, of understanding that transcended the barriers of race and culture and found common ground in the universal experience of loss. "No woman should suffer as she suffered," Nietzsche said finally, "as you have suffered. If I can prevent that suffering, if I can offer sanctuary to those who have been cast aside by their own people, then perhaps her death will have some meaning beyond mere tragedy." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a mantle, heavy with responsibility and expectation. She was no longer just a refugee seeking shelter, but a symbol of something larger, a chance for redemption that reached back through the years to touch a girl who had died believing herself beyond salvation. The Apache village appeared in the distance as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a cluster of wickiups nestled in a natural depression surrounded by red rock formations that provided both shelter and defense. The structures were low and rounded, built to withstand the desert winds that could spring up without warning and turn day into night with walls of dust and debris. Smoke rose from cooking fires, carrying the smell of roasted meat and corn mush, scents that made Clara's empty stomach clench with hunger. Children ran between the dwellings, their laughter a sharp contrast to the grim silence Clara had grown accustomed to during their journey west. Their voices carried clearly in the desert air, bright and carefree in a way that seemed impossible in such a harsh environment. As they rode into the village, curious faces turned to watch them pass. Clara saw women pausing in their work, grinding corn, weaving baskets, tending small gardens that somehow flourished in the desert soil, to study the unexpected visitors. Men emerged from their shelters, their expressions neutral but alert, hands resting casually near weapons in a gesture that was probably unconscious, but nonetheless telling. The attention made Clara's skin crawl, reminding her too much of the hostile stares she'd endured in white settlements when people learned about her circumstances. But these faces showed curiosity rather than hatred, concern rather than contempt. There was wariness, certainly. Strangers were always a potential source of danger, but no malice. Nietzsche guided his horse to a wickiup at the edge of the village, slightly apart from the others. It was smaller than most, clearly designed for temporary occupancy rather than permanent residence. The structure was well made but basic, offering shelter and privacy without the personal touches that marked a family's permanent home. He dismounted and helped Clara down, his hands steady on her waist as her legs nearly buckled beneath her. The ride had been longer than she'd realized, and her body was still weak from days of deprivation and exposure. For a moment, she swayed against him, grateful for his solid presence as the world spun around her. "You will stay here," he said, gesturing to the shelter with a movement that encompassed both invitation and command. "Food will be brought. Rest first, then we will talk about your place here." Clara nodded, too exhausted to do anything but comply. The prospect of shelter and food and safety, however temporary, was almost overwhelming after the desperate uncertainty of the past few days. Beth and Molly were helped down from their respective mounts, both swaying with fatigue and disorientation. Chado produced a small leather pouch from his belongings, showing Beth a collection of dried herbs with gentle gestures that transcended language barriers. Even without shared words, his meaning was clear. These were medicines, remedies for her injuries that came from a tradition of healing that stretched back countless generations. She understood and nodded gratefully, accepting the pouch with hands that trembled slightly.
The herbs were aromatic, carrying scents of earth and growing things that spoke of careful preparation and deep knowledge of the desert's hidden bounty. As the Apache men led their horses away toward what was obviously a communal area where the animals were cared for, Clara found herself standing with her sisters outside their temporary home. The wickiup was constructed of poles and brush, covered with hides to provide protection from the elements. It was simple but sturdy, built by people who understood the importance of shelter in a land where exposure could kill. "Are we prisoners?" Molly asked, her voice small and uncertain as she took in their surroundings. The village seemed peaceful enough, but she'd heard too many stories of captivity and forced labor to trust appearances entirely. "I don't think so," Clara replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. The Apache had weapons and numbers, could easily overpower 3 exhausted women, if that had been their intent. But their treatment so far suggested something different, a kind of cautious hospitality that felt genuine. "But we're not exactly guests either," she continued, trying to read the situation accurately. "We'll have to prove ourselves, show that we're worth the food and shelter they're providing. Nothing in this world comes free, especially not for people like us." Beth sank down onto a hide that had been spread inside the wickiup, exhaustion finally overwhelming her ability to remain upright. The shelter was dim and cool after the blazing heat outside, and she closed her eyes with relief as the worst of the sun's assault was blocked by the woven walls. "Anything's better than dying in the desert," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Whatever they ask of us, it can't be worse than what we've already endured." Clara couldn't argue with that logic. Whatever lay ahead, whatever trials awaited them in this strange new world, it had to be better than the slow death they'd been facing just hours before. She looked around the village, watching the daily activities of people who had managed to carve out a life in this harsh landscape, and felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. That first night, an elderly Apache woman brought them food. corn mush sweetened with mesquite beans, strips of dried meat that required careful chewing, and precious water in fired clay vessels decorated with intricate geometric patterns. The woman spoke no English, but her gestures were kind, her weathered face creased with lines that spoke more of laughter than sorrow. She moved with the careful dignity of age, her silver-streaked hair braided with colored beads that caught the firelight. Her clothes were practical but beautiful, leather decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken countless hours to complete. She studied each of the sisters with sharp, intelligent eyes, taking their measure in the way of women who had seen much of life and learned to read character in the set of shoulders and the expression of eyes. As they ate their first real meal in days, Clara found herself studying their surroundings with new eyes, trying to understand the culture that had taken them in. The village was organized with careful efficiency, each family's area clearly defined, but open to the community. There was no sense of the rigid privacy that characterized white settlements, but neither was there chaos. Children played games that involved impressive displays of agility and accuracy with miniature bows and arrows, their laughter mixing with the more serious sounds of adult conversation. Women worked together on various tasks, preparing food, crafting clothing from animal hides, weaving baskets with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories in their geometric complexity. But it was the men who drew Clara's attention most strongly. Unlike the white men she'd known, these Apache warriors seemed to operate within a structure that valued counsel and consensus rather than simple domination. She watched Nietzsche speaking with a group of older men around a central fire, his posture respectful as he listened to their opinions. Even when he spoke, his words seemed to be offered for consideration rather than delivered as orders. Even young Cochise, for all his hostility toward the white women, seemed to defer to the wisdom of his elders when they gathered to discuss village business. There was hierarchy here, certainly, but it seemed based on wisdom and experience, rather than mere force or intimidation. Over the following days, the sisters began to find their place in the village routine. It was a gradual process, marked by small gestures and growing understanding, rather than formal assignments. Beth, despite her injuries, proved invaluable in the preparation of food, her years of cooking for ungrateful husbands translating well to the communal meals that fed the entire community. Her gentle nature and willingness to work despite her pain earned her grudging respect from the Apache women, who seemed to recognize a kindred spirit in someone who understood the value of nurturing others. She learned to prepare traditional dishes, her hands growing steady and sure as she ground corn and tended cooking fires with the same careful attention she'd once devoted to maintaining her own household. Molly's youth and energy made her a natural companion for the village children, who seemed fascinated by her pale skin and light brown hair. They taught her their games with the patience of natural teachers, including her in their activities with an acceptance that adults rarely showed to outsiders. She learned to weave simple baskets under the guidance of the older women, her fingers growing skilled at manipulating the tough desert grasses into useful shapes. Her laughter began to return, mingling with the children's voices as they raced through the camp, or competed to see who could hit targets with their small bows. Even Cochise seemed to soften in her presence, though he maintained his suspicious distance. She would catch him watching her sometimes, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile, as if trying to reconcile his prejudices with the evidence of his own eyes. Clara threw herself into whatever tasks needed doing with the single-minded determination that had kept her alive through years of hardship. She gathered firewood from the sparse desert growth, hauling water from the spring that provided the village's lifeblood, helping to repair the wickiups when the desert winds damaged their carefully woven walls. She worked from sunrise to sunset, driven by the need to prove herself worthy of the sanctuary they'd been given. But more than that, she was driven by a growing understanding that this place represented something she'd never experienced before, a community where strength didn't require the subjugation of others, where survival was a collective effort rather than an individual struggle. But it was during the long desert evenings that she found herself drawn to Nietzsche's company. He would often sit apart from the others, as the day's heat faded into the star-filled coolness of night, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon, as if watching for threats that only he could see. Clara began joining him in these silent vigils, her presence neither welcomed nor rejected, but simply accepted. They would sit in comfortable silence, watching the desert come alive with the nocturnal creatures that emerged when the punishing sun retreated. Coyotes called to each other across the vast distances, their voices carrying messages that spoke of territory and kinship. Owls hunted on silent wings, and somewhere in the darkness, the bigger predators, mountain lions and bears, moved through their ancient territories with the patient efficiency of apex hunters. "You are different from the other white women I have known," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper, careful not to disturb the profound quiet that settled over the desert after dark. "How so?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. She'd spent so many years being told what was wrong with her, too stubborn, too independent, too willing to speak her mind, that she'd almost forgotten there might be other ways to be seen. "You do not complain about the work or the heat or the simple food. You do not expect to be served or protected without giving something in return. You work without being asked, without being watched." He turned to look at her directly, his eyes reflecting the starlight that painted the desert in silver shadows. "Most white women who come to our territory are like children, helpless and demanding, expecting the world to bend to their comfort. You are like." He paused, searching for the right words in a language that wasn't his own. "Like a warrior who happens to be a woman." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment, a warmth that had nothing to do with the residual heat radiating from the sun-baked earth. In her former life, such strength had been seen as a flaw, something to be beaten out of her by husbands who preferred their women docile and submissive. To hear it praised as a virtue was both foreign and deeply moving. "I've had to be strong," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of experiences she couldn't fully explain. The alternative was death, one way or another. Slow death of the spirit, if not the body. Nietzsche nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. They sat in comfortable silence as the desert night settled around them, the vast canopy of stars providing a sense of peace that Clara had almost forgotten was possible. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, unmarred by the smoke and dust of civilization. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile thing in this harsh landscape where survival was never guaranteed. The first sign of trouble came on a scorching afternoon 3 weeks after their arrival, when dust clouds on the horizon announced approaching riders. The entire village mobilized with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience with sudden threats. Women gathered children with swift, economical movements, shepherding them toward shelters prepared for exactly this purpose. Men took up defensive positions among the rocks that surrounded the village, their weapons appearing as if by magic. The transformation from peaceful community to military encampment took less than 5 minutes. A choreographed response born of necessity and honed by repetition. Clara watched from inside the wiki-up as Nietzsche and several other warriors rode out to meet the newcomers, their movements tense with anticipation. Through the gaps in the hide covering, she could see the approaching party more clearly now. White men, heavily armed, their clothes marking them as soldiers rather than settlers or traders. The blue uniforms were unmistakable even at a distance, as was the rigid military bearing that marked professional soldiers. They rode in formation, disciplined and alert, their weapons held ready for immediate use. This wasn't a patrol that had stumbled across the village by accident. They were here with purpose. The meeting took place well outside the village proper, voices carrying on the desert air, though the words themselves were indistinct. Clara could see gestures and postures that spoke of negotiation, of carefully balanced tension that could explode into violence at any moment. The soldiers outnumbered Nietzsche's party, but the Apache had the advantage of terrain and intimate knowledge of the landscape. When Nietzsche returned, his expression was grim as storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He sought Clara out immediately, his urgency evident in every movement, every line of his body. The careful composure he usually maintained was cracked, revealing the anger and concern beneath. "The soldiers are looking for you," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Your husbands have convinced them that you were taken against your will by Apache raiders. They've spun a tale of innocent women stolen from their loving protectors by savage warriors bent on unspeakable acts." Clara felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins, the familiar terror of Tom's reach extending even into this sanctuary. "They wouldn't dare," she breathed. But even as she said it, she knew they would. Cowards they might be, but cowards with just enough cunning to spin a story that would bring the full weight of the U.S. Army down on anyone who'd shown them kindness. "They want to search the village," Nietzsche continued, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "I have convinced them to wait until tomorrow, claiming that our chief must be consulted before strangers are allowed to enter our sacred spaces, but they will not be put off much longer. White soldiers are not known for their patience with Apache concerns." "We have to leave," Clara said immediately, her mind already racing through the possibilities. "We won't let you suffer for helping us. We can disappear into the desert, find somewhere else to hide until they give up looking." But Nietzsche shook his head firmly, his expression brooking no argument. "You would not survive another day in the desert without supplies, without protection, without knowledge of where to find water. And even if you did manage to survive, where would you go? Your husbands know this territory now, know where to look for you. Their revenge would be worse than anything you've faced so far." Clara knew he was right, but the alternative seemed impossible to accept. The thought of bringing down military retribution on these people who had shown her nothing but kindness made her stomach churn with guilt and rage. "So what do we do?" Nietzsche's expression was hard as desert stone, but there was something else there too. A determination that reminded Clara of her own refusal to lie down and die when abandonment had seemed like the end of her story. "We make them understand that you are no longer their property," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "That you have found protection they cannot break, bonds they cannot sever with their laws and their guns." "How?" Clara asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "By Apache law, you have been adopted into our tribe," Nietzsche replied, his eyes holding hers steadily. "You are under our protection now, and any who would harm you must answer to us. But such protection requires commitment. You would become one of us, truly and completely. There would be no going back to your old life, no return to the world you came from." Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the full implications of his words sank in. It was an enormous decision, one that would reshape everything she'd ever known about herself and her place in the world. To become Apache would mean abandoning not just her past, but her entire identity as a white woman in America. But as she looked around the village that had become a refuge, at the people who had shown her kindness when her own kind had left her to die, the choice became clearer. What did she really have to return to? A world where women were property, where strength was punished, and independence was seen as defiance? A civilization that had produced men like Tom and Jake and Pete, who could abandon their wives without a second thought. "What about Beth and Molly?" she asked. "They have to agree for themselves." "I won't make this choice for them." "Of course," Nietzsche replied, his respect for her position clear in his tone. "But the decision must be made quickly. The soldiers will return with the dawn, and they will not be satisfied with another delay." Clara found her sisters by the cooking fires, Beth stirring a pot of stew while Molly helped grind corn for the evening meal. Both looked up as she approached, and something in her expression made them set aside their work immediately. They could read her moods as well as she could read theirs, the product of years spent as allies in hostile territory. She explained the situation quickly and quietly, watching their faces for any sign of their thoughts. Beth's expression remained carefully neutral, but Clara could see the fear lurking behind her eyes, the terror of being dragged back to Jake's tender mercies. Molly looked shocked, then thoughtful, then determined in rapid succession, her young face cycling through emotions like weather patterns across the desert sky. "They take us back," Beth said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back to him." Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, where the bruises had finally faded, but the memory remained as vivid as the day they were made. "Over my dead body," Clara said fiercely, meaning every word. "But this isn't just about escaping them. It's about choosing a new life, a new identity. We'd be Apache women with all that entails. We'd be giving up everything we were to become something entirely different." Molly straightened her shoulders, and for a moment Clara saw the woman she was becoming rather than the girl she'd been. The desert had changed her, strengthened her in ways that went beyond mere physical survival. "These people saved our lives when our own husbands left us for dead. They've treated us with more respect in 3 weeks than our marriages gave us in years. I know where I belong." Beth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as she weighed the decision that would determine the rest of her life. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "Jake would kill me if he got his hands on me again," she said simply. "He promised as much the night they left us. Said if he ever saw my face again, he'd finish what he started. At least this way, I have a chance at something better. A chance to be more than just someone's property." Clara felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by a new kind of terror. They were about to step off the edge of everything they'd ever known, into a world they barely understood. But they would do it together, and they would do it as free women making their own choices, for perhaps the first time in their lives. The ceremony took place that night under the vast canopy of desert stars, conducted by the tribal elders with a solemnity that Clara found deeply moving. She understood little of the Apache words spoken over them, the ancient phrases that connected them to countless generations of people who had called this harsh land home. But the intent was clear. They were being welcomed into the tribe not as guests or refugees, but as sisters, as family. Sacred herbs were burned, their smoke carrying prayers to spirits that governed the desert and all who dwelt within its embrace. Paint was applied to their faces, in patterns that spoke of new beginnings and spiritual transformation. New names were given, Apache names that rolled strangely off their tongues, but felt right in ways their old names never had. Clara became Dahana, meaning one who endures, a recognition of her strength in the face of adversity. Beth was given the name Ayana, eternal blossom, acknowledgement of her gentle strength that had flourished even under brutal treatment. Molly became Kamama, butterfly, a tribute to her transformation from frightened girl to confident young woman. The ceremony concluded with the sharing of food and water, symbolic acts that bound them to their new people and their new lives. As Clara, now Dahana, ate from the communal bowl and drank from the sacred vessels, she felt something shift inside her chest. The woman who had been abandoned in the desert was truly dead, replaced by someone stronger and freer than she had ever dared imagine. When the soldiers arrived the next morning, they found an Apache village going about its daily business with no sign of the white women they sought. The tribal spokesman, including Naiche and Chato, met with the military commander with perfect composure, their faces revealing nothing of the drama that had unfolded the night before. Clara watched from inside a wickiup, her heart pounding as blue uniformed soldiers moved through the village with the arrogant confidence of men accustomed to having their demands met without question. But she need not have worried. Dressed in Apache clothing, her hair braided in the native style, her skin darkened by weeks under the desert sun, she was invisible to men who saw only what they expected to see. The search lasted most of the day, soldiers poking through dwellings and questioning villagers through interpreters who seemed remarkably unhelpful. The Apache answered questions with the literal precision of people who understood the power of carefully chosen words, revealing nothing while technically telling the truth. No, they had not seen any white women matching the descriptions provided. No, no strangers had been brought to the village recently. No, they knew nothing of any raid or kidnapping. The soldiers grew increasingly frustrated as their search turned up nothing but blank stares and unhelpful shrugs. Eventually they gave up and rode away, their mission apparently unsuccessful. Clara's husbands had not come with them. Whether from cowardice or cunning, she would never know. But as she watched the dust clouds recede into the distance, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. That evening, as the village celebrated their successful deception with extra food and songs that carried late into the night, Clara found herself once again sitting with Nietzsche under the stars. But now the silence between them carried a different quality, charged with possibilities that neither had dared consider before. "You are truly one of us now," he said finally, his voice carrying a warmth it hadn't held before. "Dahana of the Chiricahua Apache." She tested the name on her tongue, finding that it fit better than the one she'd been born with. "It feels right," she admitted. "More right than anything has felt in years. Like I was always meant to be this person, but never had the chance to become her." Nietzsche turned to study her profile in the starlight, his expression thoughtful. "And what of the future, Dahana? What do you see for yourself in this new life?" Clara, Dahana, considered the question carefully. The old life was truly dead now, buried in the desert along with all the pain and fear and helplessness it had contained. This new existence offered possibilities she'd never imagined, freedoms she'd never tasted. But it also offered something else, something she could see reflected in Nietzsche's dark eyes as he waited for her answer. "I see a life worth living," she said at last. "A life worth fighting for. A place where strength is valued rather than punished, where being a woman doesn't mean being property." And when he reached out to take her hand in his, calloused palm against calloused palm, she didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined their fingers, a promise made without words under the eternal witness of the desert stars. The transformation was complete. 3 broken women had died in the wasteland, but 3 Apache sisters had been born from their ashes, ready to embrace whatever challenges this harsh but honest land might bring. In losing everything they'd thought they were, they had found everything they were meant to become. The desert had tested them and found them worthy, and now it would shelter them as they built new lives from the ruins of the old.